contractor's security consultant. The morning routine in their suburban Cleveland home was predictable. His wife Nicole getting their 8-year-old son Jimmy ready for school, while Thomas reviewed case files over coffee. It was the kind of ordinary life he'd fought to build after his decade in Army intelligence. "Daddy, can we go to the park after school?" Jimmy asked, bouncing into the kitchen with his backpack. "Absolutely, buddy. But first, you need to actually make it through Mrs. Peterson's math class." Thomas grinned, ruffling his son's dark hair. Nicole kissed Thomas goodbye, her auburn hair catching the morning light. "Don't work too late again. You missed story time 3 nights this week. I promise." Just wrapping up the Morrison Industries case. Thomas had been investigating security vulnerabilities for Ray Morrison's tech company, but the work kept him at the office until well past Jimmy's bedtime. The day proceeded normally until Thomas returned home at 7 p.m. to find Ellen Irwin from next door waiting on his porch. Ellen was a retired nurse in her 60s, known for her garden and her tendency to keep watch over the neighborhood kids. Her usual warm smile was replaced by deep concern. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about something troubling," she began, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the evening chill. "Of course, Ellen. What's wrong?" "It's about Jimmy." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've been hearing crying at night, coming from his room. Not just crying, screaming, saying stop over and over." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Ellen, that's impossible. Jimmy sleeps through the night. Since he was 3, he's never had nightmares or—" "I know how it sounds," Ellen interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's been going on for 2 weeks now, always between midnight and 2 a.m. I wouldn't bring it up if I wasn't certain." Thomas studied her face. Ellen Irwin wasn't prone to dramatics or gossip. If she was coming to him with this, she believed every word. "Have you seen anything? Anyone coming or going?" "That's just it, no. Your house looks completely normal. But the crying? Thomas, it breaks my heart. That child is terrified." After Ellen left, Thomas found Nicole in the living room grading papers. She taught 4th grade at Jimmy's school and often brought work home. "Nicole, has Jimmy mentioned having bad dreams lately? Any problems at school?" She looked up concerned. "No, nothing. He's been his usual happy self." "What?" Thomas explained Ellen's visit, watching Nicole's expression shift from confusion to worry. "That's ridiculous," Nicole said finally. "Jimmy doesn't cry at night. We'd hear him. His room is right down the hall." "I know," but Ellen seemed genuinely upset. They checked on Jimmy, finding him peacefully asleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. His room was exactly as they'd left it. Star Wars posters on the walls, action figures lined up on his dresser, the night light casting gentle shadows. "See? Fast asleep," Nicole whispered. But something nagged at Thomas. His training had taught him to trust reliable sources, and Ellen Irwin was as reliable as they came. Moreover, her specific details, the timing, the word stop, weren't the kind of thing someone would fabricate. Later that night, lying in bed, Thomas stared at the ceiling. Nicole slept soundly beside him, but his mind was racing. In his intelligence work, he'd learned that the most dangerous threats often hid behind facades of normalcy. If someone was targeting his family, they'd be careful to maintain appearances during the day. At 12:47 a.m., Thomas heard it. A soft whimpering, barely audible through the walls. Then clearer, "Stop, please stop." Thomas sat up, his heart hammering. The sound was definitely coming from Jimmy's room. He glanced at Nicole, still asleep, then slipped out of bed and moved silently toward the hallway. The crying grew more distinct as he approached Jimmy's door. But there was something wrong with the voice. It sounded like Jimmy, but not quite. The pitch was slightly different, the accent not quite right. Thomas pressed his ear to the door. The crying continued, punctuated by whispered pleas. "Stop. I want to go home. I want to go home." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Jimmy was home. This was his room, his house, his bed. Thomas's hand moved to the doorknob, but something stopped him. His tactical training kicked in. Rushing in blind could endanger whoever was inside or alert potential threats. Instead, he retreated to his bedroom and grabbed his phone, setting it to record. The crying continued for another 20 minutes before gradually fading to silence. The next morning, Jimmy bounded into the kitchen as usual, cheerful and energetic. No signs of distress, no indication he'd spent the night crying. When Thomas asked about his sleep, Jimmy looked confused. "I slept great, Dad." "What?" Thomas studied his son's face, searching for any deception. But Jimmy seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. After Nicole and Jimmy left for school, Thomas reviewed the audio recording. The crying was clear, unmistakable. But when he played it for Nicole that evening, her reaction was immediate and fierce. That's not Jimmy's voice. Chapter 2. The Investigation. Thomas spent the next day in a state of barely controlled tension. His morning security briefing at Morrison Industries felt surreal, discussing cyber threats and access protocols while his mind raced with questions about what was happening in his own home. He left work early, something he never did, and drove to Jimmy's school. Through the classroom window, he could see his son laughing with friends during recess, completely normal. Thomas approached Mrs. Peterson, Jimmy's teacher. "Has Jimmy seemed different lately? Tired, distracted, anything unusual?" Mrs. Peterson, a veteran educator with kind eyes, shook her head. "Jimmy's been wonderful. Energetic as always. He did mention something interesting yesterday, though." "What's that?" "He asked if other kids have night brothers. When I asked what he meant, he said sometimes he feels like there's another boy in his room at night, but he can't see him because he's asleep. I assumed it was an imaginary friend situation." Thomas felt ice in his veins. Did he seem upset about this night brother? Not at all. If anything, he seemed protective. Said the night brother was sad and he wished he could help him. That evening, Thomas made a decision. He told Nicole he needed to work late on a case, but instead, he prepared for surveillance. From his Army days, he still had night vision equipment and recording devices. He set up in the guest room across from Jimmy's, with a clear view of the hallway. At 11:30 p.m., Nicole was asleep. Jimmy had been in bed since 8, and the house was quiet. Thomas positioned himself with his equipment, waiting. At 12:15 a.m., he heard the soft click of a door opening. Through his night vision scope, Thomas watched his front door ease open. A figure slipped inside, tall, thin, moving with practiced stealth. The intruder knew the house layout, avoiding the creaky floorboard by the stairs, stepping carefully around the coffee table Nicole always left slightly askew. Thomas's hand moved to his service weapon, secured in a lockbox beside him, but he forced himself to wait. He needed to understand what was happening before acting. The figure approached Jimmy's room and opened the door with a key. A key. Someone had prepared for this, had access, had planned this operation. Minutes later, the figure emerged carrying a small, unconscious form, Jimmy. But instead of leaving, the intruder disappeared back into Jimmy's room. 30 seconds later, they emerged again, but this time without carrying anyone. Thomas realized with growing horror what was happening. Someone was swapping his son with another child. Every night, taking Jimmy somewhere and leaving another child at his place. A child who was being abused, who cried and begged for it to stop, who wanted to go home. The intruder left through the front door, locking it behind them. Thomas waited exactly 10 minutes, then crept to Jimmy's room. Inside, a child lay in Jimmy's bed. A boy who looked remarkably like his son, but was clearly not him. This child was thinner, with bruises barely visible in the dim light, and scars on his arms that Jimmy had never had. Thomas's military training warred with his parental instincts. He wanted to comfort this terrified child, but he needed to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. He retreated to the guest room and made a decision that went against every fatherly instinct. He would wait until morning to see what happened next. At 5:30 a.m., just before Nicole's alarm, the intruder returned. They entered Jimmy's room and emerged with a substitute child, then disappeared inside again. When they left the final time, Thomas knew Jimmy had been returned. The precision, the timing, the keys, this wasn't random. This was organized, professional, and had been going on for who knows how long. After the intruder left, Thomas checked on Jimmy, who was sleeping peacefully, no signs of distress or awareness of what had happened. But when Thomas looked closer, he noticed things he'd missed before, tiny puncture marks on Jimmy's arm, consistent with sedative injections. His son was being drugged every night. Thomas spent the morning researching missing children cases, child trafficking networks, anything that might explain what he'd witnessed. What he found made his blood run cold. There were reports of children being used as substitutes in trafficking rings, healthy, well-adjusted kids who could pass casual inspection while other children are being abused or sold. The substitutes were drugged to ensure they had no memory of the switches. By afternoon, Thomas had a theory that filled him with rage and determination. Someone was using Jimmy as cover for a child abuse or trafficking operation. They were sedating his son and temporarily replacing him with victims, knowing that a crying child in a normal suburban home would draw less attention than one in an obvious criminal operation. But they'd made two mistakes. They hadn't accounted for Ellen Irwin's vigilance, and they'd chosen the wrong father to target. Thomas Savage had spent 10 years in Army intelligence, specializing in counterintelligence and hostage recovery. He'd dismantled terrorist cells in Afghanistan and uncovered spy networks in Eastern Europe. He knew how to be patient, how to gather intelligence, and how to systematically destroy his enemies. As he sat in his office that afternoon, Thomas began planning. He wouldn't go to the police, not yet. Trafficking rings had connections everywhere, and a premature move could result in evidence being destroyed and victims disappearing forever. No, Thomas would handle this the way he'd handled threats in the field, methodically, thoroughly, and with extreme prejudice. The people who had violated his home and endangered his son had no idea what they'd unleashed. Chapter 3. The Network. Thomas spent the next 3 nights documenting everything. Using military-grade surveillance equipment he'd borrowed from his security consulting work, he tracked the intruders' movements, photographed faces, and recorded license plates. The operation was more sophisticated than he'd initially thought. 3 different people rotated the duty, 2 men and a woman. They had keys to his house, suggesting inside knowledge of his family's routines. They knew exactly when Nicole took her sleeping medication for her chronic back pain, knew Thomas's work schedule, and understood Jimmy's sleep patterns. Someone had been watching his family for weeks, maybe months. Thomas recognized the organizational structure from his intelligence work, a cell-based operation with multiple layers of security. The people doing the physical work weren't the ones calling the shots. On the 4th night, he followed the intruder's vehicle, a nondescript gray sedan that led him to an industrial area on Cleveland's east side. The car disappeared into a warehouse complex owned by Stuart Decker, according to property records Thomas accessed through his security clearance databases. Stuart Decker. The name meant nothing to Thomas initially, but a deeper investigation revealed a concerning profile. Decker was a businessman with legitimate interests in logistics and transportation, but his companies had been investigated, never charged, in connection with several missing persons cases over the past 5 years. Thomas dug deeper, using contact from his Army days who now worked in various federal agencies. What he learned made him physically ill. Stuart Decker ran a sophisticated child trafficking network that used substitute children to maintain the appearance of normalcy for victims' families. Healthy children like Jimmy would be sedated and temporarily replaced with trafficking victims, allowing abuse to occur in seemingly normal suburban homes while parents remained unaware. The genius of the system was its invisibility. Victims were rotated frequently to prevent attachment or escape attempts. Substitute children were returned before parents woke, creating the perfect cover. If authorities ever investigated reports of crying or distress, they'd find normal children in normal homes, making the reports appear false. But Decker had made a critical error in targeting the Savage family. Through Ellen Irwin's concern and Thomas's investigation, the network was about to be exposed. Thomas learned that Decker operated through his sister, Gail Decker, who managed the day-to-day operations while Stuart handled the business side. Gail was a former social worker who'd been fired for inappropriate contact with children in her care. She'd used her knowledge of child psychology and family systems to design the substitution protocol. The warehouse Thomas had followed was just one of 6 locations in the network. His research revealed safe houses, transport routes, and financial records hidden behind shell companies. But the most damning discovery came when Thomas hacked into Stuart Decker's personal files. Among the business documents, he found a list labeled Current Substitutes with Jimmy's name, address, school, and detailed behavioral notes. Subject shows high compliance. Responds well to light sedation. Family maintains predictable schedule. Father travels frequently for work. Mother takes medication nightly. Ideal for long-term rotation. The clinical language describing his son's exploitation filled Thomas with a cold rage he hadn't felt since his combat days. But this time, the enemy had made it personal. Thomas discovered that 12 children were currently being used as substitutes, while approximately 30 victims were being trafficked through the network. The operation generated millions in revenue through online auctions and private sales to wealthy predators. Among the financial records, Thomas found something that explained how the network had targeted his family. Ray Morrison, his current client, was a customer. Morrison had specifically requested access to clean suburban operations and had provided Decker with information about his security consultant's family. The betrayal cut deep. Thomas had been working to protect Morrison Industries while Morrison was using that access to target Jimmy. That night, as Thomas watched the intruder perform the nightly switch, he made his decision. Going to the authorities would take months, during which children would continue to suffer. The network would likely discover the investigation and scatter, taking victims with them. No, Thomas would use the skills the Army had taught him to dismantle this operation from within. But first, he had to neutralize the immediate threat to Jimmy without alerting the network. A direct confrontation would simply cause them to relocate and target other families. Thomas spent the following day acquiring equipment and establishing secure communications with 3 former Army colleagues who specialized in covert operations. Phil Nielsen ran a private security firm in Chicago. Sean Gillespie operated investigative service in Miami. Alan Irwin, Ellen's nephew, worked in federal intelligence. Each of them owed Thomas their lives from their deployment days. When he called in those debts, they didn't ask questions. The plan Thomas developed was elegant in its simplicity. He would infiltrate the network by posing as a potential customer while his team systematically documented evidence and located victims. Once they had enough information to ensure all children could be safely recovered, they would coordinate simultaneous raids on all 6 locations. But Thomas added a personal element to the mission. Stuart and Gail Decker wouldn't just be arrested. They would experience the same terror they'd inflicted on children. Thomas would ensure they understood exactly what it felt like to be powerless, afraid, and completely at the mercy of someone who viewed them as objects rather than human beings. The network had chosen to target his family because they thought Thomas was a typical suburban father, someone who could be manipulated and controlled. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. Chapter 4: Infiltration. Thomas's first step was protecting Jimmy while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Using his security consulting resources, he installed microscopic cameras throughout the house, linked to encrypted servers that would document every intrusion. He also began giving Jimmy daily vitamins that contained a mild stimulant to counteract the sedatives, ensuring his son would have some awareness if anything went wrong. Most importantly, Thomas reached out to Dr. Rebecca Abbott, a pediatric specialist who'd worked with trafficking victims. Without revealing the full situation, he had her examine Jimmy for signs of long-term sedative use. Dr. Abbott confirmed Thomas's suspicions. Jimmy showed indicators of chronic low-level drug exposure, including slightly delayed reflexes and minor memory gaps. Mr. Savage, Dr. Abbott said carefully, these symptoms suggest ongoing pharmaceutical intervention. If someone is medicating your son without your knowledge, that's extremely dangerous. Thomas thanked her and scheduled follow-up appointments, knowing that Dr. Abbott's documentation would be crucial evidence when the time came. Meanwhile, Thomas began building his undercover identity. Using his security clearance and intelligence contacts, he created a false persona. Carlos Conley, a wealthy businessman with interest in overseas manufacturing who'd recently relocated to Cleveland. The key to infiltrating the network was Ray Morrison. Thomas confronted his client during what appeared to be a routine security briefing. "Ray, I need to ask you about something sensitive," Thomas began, watching Morrison's reaction carefully. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Of course, what's on your mind? I've heard rumors about certain exclusive services available in Cleveland. Services that cater to specific tastes. Thomas let the implication hang in the air. Morrison's face went pale, then flushed red. Thomas, I don't know what you're talking about. Ray, we've worked together for 2 years. I know you have connections I could benefit from. I'm willing to pay handsomely for an introduction. It took 3 more conversations before Morrison cracked. The combination of Thomas's implied knowledge and the promise of shared culpability finally broke down Morrison's resistance. There's a man named Stuart Decker, Morrison admitted reluctantly. He provides specialized services. Very discreet, very exclusive. How do I make contact? You don't. He makes contact with you. But I could mention that you're interested in his boutique offerings. Thomas had Morrison arrange an introduction, positioning himself as a potential high-value customer seeking access to Decker's premium services. The meeting was set for a restaurant in downtown Cleveland. Thomas arrived early, positioning himself with clear sight lines and emergency exits, habits from his military days that could save his life if the situation turned hostile. Stuart Decker was not what Thomas had expected. Mid-50s, well-dressed, articulate, and possessing the kind of polished charm that suggested legitimate business success. He looked like a suburban father himself, which made his crimes even more revolting. Ray tells me you're interested in exclusive experiences, Decker said after minimal pleasantries. I have specific tastes and unlimited resources, Thomas replied. Ray suggested you might be able to accommodate unusual requests. Decker studied Thomas carefully. What kind of unusual? I prefer authenticity. Not professionals, not actors. Real situations, real reactions. Thomas forced himself to speak the words, knowing they represented the mindset of the network's customers. That's highly specialized, inexpensive. Money is no object. Privacy is essential. Over the course of an hour, Decker gradually revealed the network structure. He offered Thomas access to what he called residential experiences, situations where customers could interact with children in seemingly normal suburban settings, making the encounters appear less criminal to both participants and victims. The beauty of our residential program, Decker explained, is that it takes place in actual family homes. The children believe they're simply visiting relatives or friends, much more natural than artificial settings. Thomas wanted to reach across the table and break Decker's neck, but he maintained his cover. How do you ensure discretion? The families are completely unaware. We have methods of ensuring privacy during our sessions. Decker smiled, clearly proud of his system's sophistication. I'm interested in a specific type, Thomas said. Young boys, dark hair, athletic build. Age 7 to 10. Decker's eyes lit up with avarice. I have exactly what you're looking for. In fact, we have a client who's been developing a relationship with a particularly ideal subject. 8 years old, very responsive, from an excellent family situation. Thomas realized Decker was describing Jimmy. When can I meet this subject? We're very careful about introductions. First, you'll need to demonstrate your financial commitment. Our premium residential experiences start at $50,000 per session. Thomas didn't flinch. Acceptable. How do we proceed? Decker outlined the network's security protocols. Customers were thoroughly vetted. Payment was required in advance through cryptocurrency, and all contact was managed through encrypted communications. I'll have my associate reach out to you within 48 hours, Decker said. She'll handle the details and arrange your first residential experience. As they parted, Decker handed Thomas a business card for a legitimate logistics company, the perfect cover for the network's transportation needs. That evening, Thomas briefed his team through encrypted channels. Phil Nielsen confirmed that similar networks operated in Chicago and Detroit, suggesting a larger interstate operation. Sean Gillespie had identified financial patterns that revealed connections to trafficking rings in South America. Alan Irwin reported that federal agencies were aware of Decker, but lacked sufficient evidence for prosecution. Tom, Alan said during their secure video call, you're walking into an extremely dangerous situation. These people have killed witnesses before. I know the risks, Thomas replied. But 30 kids are being trafficked, and my son is being used to facilitate their abuse. I'm not backing down. Phil Nielsen leaned forward on his screen. What do you need from us? Surveillance, evidence gathering, and extraction support. When this goes down, it has to be perfect. If even one child is harmed because we moved too quickly or too slowly, I'll never forgive myself. The team began coordinating their resources, but Thomas had one more preparation to make. That night, he sat down with Nicole for a conversation he'd been dreading. Nicole, I need to tell you something about what's been happening to Jimmy. By the time he finished explaining, Nicole was crying and furious in equal measure. Those monsters have been in our house. They've been drugging our son every night for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Nicole's teacher instincts kicked in. What about the other children? The ones they're hurting? I'm going to get them out. All of them. Ow! Thomas looked into his wife's eyes, seeing the same protective fire that had made him fall in love with her years ago. By being the nightmare these people never saw coming. Chapter 5. The Trap. Gail Decker contacted Thomas 2 days later through an encrypted messaging app. Her voice was professional, but carried an undertone of cruelty that made Thomas's skin crawl. Mr. Conley, my brother speaks highly of your interests. I understand you're looking for a residential experience with specific parameters. That's correct. I value authenticity above all else. Excellent. We have a subject who matches your preferences perfectly. 8 years old, very well behaved, from an ideal family situation. Are you prepared to make the financial commitment my brother discussed? Thomas had already moved $50,000 in cryptocurrency to an untraceable wallet. Payment is ready to transfer. Wonderful. The experience will take place tomorrow night. I'll send you an address and specific instructions. Please understand that any deviation from our protocols will result in immediate termination of services and consequences for all involved. The threat was clear, but Thomas had expected nothing less from a professional criminal organization. That afternoon, Thomas met with his team at a secure location, a warehouse owned by Phil Nielsen Security Company. They'd assembled impressive resources, surveillance equipment, communication gear, and tactical weapons that would make a military unit envious. The address Gail sent is Jimmy's house, Thomas explained. They're planning to let me abuse my own son, believing I don't know it's him. Sean Gillespie shook his head in disgust. The psychological manipulation is as sick as the physical abuse. It's also their weakness, Thomas replied. They're so confident in their system that they've become careless. Tomorrow night, we're going to use that arrogance against them. The plan Thomas outlined was complex but elegant. While he maintained his cover as a customer, his team would be documenting everything from multiple angles. Alan Irwin would coordinate with federal agents positioned at the other 5 network locations, ready to move simultaneously when Thomas gave the signal. The key is timing, Thomas emphasized. We need irrefutable evidence before anyone moves. If the network suspects a coordinated operation, they'll scatter and take the victims with them. But Thomas had a personal agenda beyond collecting evidence. He wanted Stuart and Gail Decker to experience the same helplessness they'd inflicted on children. That evening, Thomas played with Jimmy in their backyard, knowing it might be the last normal moment they'd share for a while. Jimmy was building an elaborate fort out of cardboard boxes, his imagination transforming the simple structure into a space fortress. Dad, can you help me make the control room? Jimmy asked, holding up a cereal box. Thomas knelt beside his son, carefully cutting windows and drawing control panels. As he worked, he memorized every detail of Jimmy's face, every gesture, every laugh. Tomorrow night, when a network brought Jimmy back drugged and confused, Thomas would use his rage to fuel what came next. Jimmy, you know Daddy loves you more than anything in the world, right? Of course, Dad. You tell me every day. And you know that no matter what happens, Daddy will always protect you. Jimmy looked up from his fort, sensing something in Thomas's voice. Are you okay, Dad? You seem different lately. Thomas forced a smile. I'm fine, buddy. Just work stuff. Come on, let's finish this control room. The next evening, Thomas prepared for the mission with the same methodical precision he'd used in Afghanistan. He dressed as Carlos Conley, expensive suit, subtle cologne, and a demeanor that suggested wealth and entitlement. Hidden throughout his clothing were micro-cameras and recording devices that would capture everything. At 11:47 p.m., Thomas knocked on his own front door. Gail Decker answered, her appearance as deceptively normal as her brother's. She looked like a soccer mom, which made her crimes even more disturbing. "Mr. Conley, welcome. Please come in." Thomas entered his own home as a stranger, noting how Gail had prepared the space. Soft lighting, classical music, and an atmosphere designed to normalize what was about to occur. "The subject is in the bedroom upstairs," Gail explained. "He's been prepared for your visit, sedated but responsive. He believes he's dreaming, which ensures compliance while maintaining the authentic reactions you requested." Thomas followed Gail upstairs, his hidden cameras recording every word and movement. At Jimmy's bedroom door, Gail turned to him with a predatory smile. "1 hour, Mr. Conley. The subject won't remember anything afterward, but I assure you the experience will be memorable." She opened the door, revealing Jimmy lying in bed, clearly drugged but conscious. His eyes were unfocused, and he moved sluggishly when he saw Thomas. "Hello, Jimmy," Thomas said softly, his heart breaking at seeing his son in this condition. Jimmy tried to focus on Thomas's face. Do I know you?" This was the moment Thomas had planned for, the point where he would drop his cover and begin the operation that would destroy the network. But first, he needed to ensure Jimmy's safety and get him away from Gail. "Actually, Jimmy, you know me very well," Thomas said, moving closer to his son. "Gail, I need to discuss additional services. Could we step outside for a moment?" Gail looked surprised but nodded. "Of course. The subject will be fine alone for a few minutes." As they moved toward the hallway, Thomas activated a signal device hidden in his watch. Throughout Cleveland, his team and federal agents received the coordinated attack command. But Thomas wasn't finished with Gail Decker yet. In the hallway, he turned to face her with a smile that would have frozen her blood if she'd understood what it meant. "Gail, I have a confession to make." "Oh, my name isn't Carlos Conley. It's Thomas Savage, and that's my son in there." The color drained from Gail's face as she realized the trap she'd walked into. Her hand moved toward her purse, probably reaching for a weapon or communication device, but Thomas was faster. His military training took over, and Gail found herself on the floor with Thomas's knee on her chest and her hand secured behind her back with zip ties. "Now," Thomas said conversationally, "let's discuss what you've done to my family." Chapter 6, Justice Begins. Thomas secured Gail in Jimmy's closet while he tended to his son. Jimmy was conscious but heavily sedated, his pupils dilated and his movements unsteady. "Dad," Jimmy mumbled, trying to focus on Thomas's face. "I keep having weird dreams." "I know, buddy, but you're safe now. Everything's going to be okay." Thomas called Dr. Rebecca Abbott, who arrived within 20 minutes with medical equipment and nursing staff. While they worked to flush the sedatives from Jimmy's system, Thomas prepared for the next phase of his operation. Through his encrypted communicator, reports were coming in from across the city. Federal agents had simultaneously raided all 6 network locations, recovering 28 children and arresting dozens of conspirators. The coordination was flawless. Years of planning and intelligence gathering had paid off in one decisive night. But Thomas's personal business with the Decker siblings was just beginning. Once Jimmy was stable and in Dr. Abbott's care, Thomas returned to deal with Gail. He found her trying to escape from the zip ties, her composure finally cracking under the reality of her situation. "Mr. Savage, please, I can't explain." "No need," Thomas interrupted. "I've been documenting your operation for weeks. I know exactly what you've done." He pulled up chair and sat across from her, his demeanor calm and conversational. 28 children, Gail. 28 kids you've traumatized for profit, including my son. We never hurt them. You drugged my 8-year-old every night for months. You facilitated his abuse by strangers. You turned his bedroom into a crime scene." Thomas's voice remained level, but his eyes burned with controlled fury. "Gail, tried a different approach. I can give you information. Names, locations, financial records. I can help you shut down similar operations." "I already have all that," Thomas said. My team has been building cases against your entire network. By morning, everyone from your customers to your money launderers will be in federal custody. The truth was settling in on Gail's face. There would be no negotiation, no deal, no escape. Thomas had systematically dismantled everything she'd built. What do you want from me? Thomas leaned forward. I want you to understand what it feels like to be completely powerless. To be at the mercy of someone who sees you as an object rather than a human being. Over the next hour, Thomas methodically broke down Gail's psychological defenses using techniques he'd learned in intelligence interrogation. He didn't touch her, didn't threaten physical violence, but he systematically destroyed her sense of control and security. He played recordings of her own voice, describing the children she'd trafficked. He showed her photographs of the victims, forcing her to acknowledge each child as an individual with a name, a family, and a future she'd try to steal. This is Sarah Martinez, Thomas said, holding up a photo of a 6-year-old girl. She's been missing for 8 months. Her parents think she's dead, but you've been selling access to her for $5,000 a night. By the time Thomas finished, Gail was sobbing and begging for forgiveness that would never come. Please, I'll do anything. I'll testify against Stewart, against all of them. I'll spend my life making amends. You'll spend your life in prison, Thomas replied. But first, you're going to help me with your brother. Meanwhile, across the city, Stewart Decker was discovering that his network had collapsed in a single coordinated strike. Federal agents had arrested him at his mansion, seizing computers, financial records, and evidence that would guarantee life imprisonment. But Thomas had made special arrangements for Stewart's transport to federal custody. Instead of being taken directly to the courthouse, Stewart found himself in the back of an unmarked van that stopped at a warehouse on Cleveland's west side, the same warehouse where Phil Nielsen's security team was based. Stewart was brought into a room that looked disturbingly like the preparation rooms his network had used to condition victims. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. Thomas entered wearing the same expensive suit he'd worn as Carlos Conley. But now Stewart could see him for what he really was, a predator's worst nightmare. Hello, Stewart. I'm Thomas Savage. Stewart's face went pale as he recognized the name from his network's target files. The substitute's father, Stewart whispered. Among other things, I'm also a former Army intelligence officer with 10 years of experience in counterterrorism operations. And I've spent the last month studying your organization. Thomas pulled up a chair and began the same psychological dismantling he'd performed on Gail, but with Stewart, he added a crucial element: fear. Stewart, your sister is in federal custody. Your customers are being arrested as we speak. Your financial assets have been frozen. Your properties have been seized. In approximately 6 hours, you'll be charged with conspiracy to commit human trafficking, child endangerment, racketeering, and 37 counts of facilitating child abuse. Stewart tried to maintain his composure, but Thomas could see the panic building. But before that happens, Thomas continued, you and I are going to have a conversation about justice. Thomas had planned this moment for weeks. Stewart Decker would face the full weight of the law. But first, he would experience a fraction of the terror he'd inflicted on innocent children. Over the next 4 hours, Thomas systematically destroyed Stewart's sense of security using the same psychological techniques the network had employed on their victims. He played recordings of children crying, showed photographs of traumatized faces, and forced Stewart to confront the human cost of his crimes. But Thomas's most effective weapon was patience. He didn't rush, didn't lose his temper, didn't give Stewart any indication of when the psychological pressure would end. Just as the trafficked children had lived in constant uncertainty and fear, Stewart now experienced the same helpless anxiety. By dawn, Stewart Decker was a broken man who would confess to anything to make the psychological torture stop. But Thomas wasn't finished yet. Chapter 7: Systematic Destruction. The Morning News reported the arrests as the largest child trafficking bust in Ohio history. 28 children recovered, 47 adults arrested, and a network worth millions of dollars dismantled overnight. Federal prosecutors promised that everyone involved would face the harshest possible sentences. But the public didn't know about Thomas's personal war against the network's leadership. Jimmy was recovering at home under Dr. Abbott's care, his system gradually clearing of the sedatives. Nicole had taken leave from her teaching job to focus on helping their son process what he'd experienced. The family was beginning to heal, but Thomas's mission wasn't complete. Through his intelligence contacts, Thomas learned that the network had connections far beyond Cleveland. Stewart and Gail Decker were middle management in an organization that spanned multiple states and included customers from corporate boardrooms to political offices. Thomas decided to expand his scope. Using evidence gathered from the Decker operation, Thomas began identifying and targeting the network's customers. Ray Morrison was first, the client who'd betrayed Thomas's family to facilitate Jimmy's exploitation. Morrison had been arrested with the others, but Thomas wanted him to understand the personal cost of his choices. He arranged for Morrison to be released on bail, knowing that the man's sense of security would be false and temporary. 3 days after the arrests, Morrison received a package at his home containing photographs of every child he'd paid to abuse, along with their names, ages, and the dates of his sessions with them. The accompanying note was simple. They all have names. They all have families. They all remember you. Morrison called Thomas desperately. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to spend every remaining day of your life understanding what you've done," Thomas replied. "And I want you to know that I'll be watching to ensure you face full justice." Thomas had similar packages delivered to the other 12 customers who'd been identified but not yet arrested. Each package contained evidence of their crimes and a promise that Thomas would personally ensure they face consequences. The psychological pressure worked exactly as intended. Within a week, 3 customers had turned themselves into authorities, preferring federal prison to the uncertainty of Thomas's personal attention. But Thomas's most elaborate revenge was reserved for the network's financial infrastructure. Using skills learned in Army intelligence, he began systematically destroying the organization's money laundering operations. The network had hidden millions of dollars through shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and offshore banks. Thomas identified every account, every transaction, and every financial institution that had facilitated the trafficking operation. Working with Alan Irwin's federal contacts, Thomas provided evidence that resulted in forfeiture proceedings against 87 accounts containing over $12 million. The seized funds would be used to provide therapy and support services for the recovered children. But Thomas went further. He identified the legitimate businesses that had unknowingly facilitated the network's operations: shipping companies, property management firms, and security services that had been manipulated into supporting the trafficking infrastructure. Thomas personally visited the executives of these companies, providing them with evidence of how their services had been misused. In every case, the companies immediately terminated relationships with network-connected clients and implemented new security protocols to prevent future exploitation. The ripple effect spread across multiple industries as businesses realized they needed to scrutinize their clients more carefully to avoid becoming unwitting accomplices to criminal organizations. Meanwhile, Stewart and Gail Decker were learning that their legal troubles were just the beginning of their problems. Thomas had arranged for certain information to reach their fellow inmates, specifically details about their crimes against children. In prison culture, child abusers occupied the lowest position in the hierarchy, subject to constant threats and violence from other inmates. Stewart and Gail found themselves in protective custody, isolated from the general prison population, but psychologically tormented by the knowledge that their reputations preceded them wherever they went. But Thomas's most sophisticated revenge involved the network's victims and their families. Through Dr. Rebecca Abbott and her colleagues, Thomas helped establish a comprehensive support system for the recovered children. The seized assets funded therapy programs, educational support, and long-term care for the 28 victims. More importantly, Thomas ensured that each child's family understood exactly who was responsible for their trauma. The families were given complete information about the network structure, the roles played by Stewart and Gail Decker, and the customers who had paid to abuse their children. The psychological impact on Stewart and Gail was devastating. They faced not only criminal prosecution, but civil lawsuits from 28 families seeking damages for the trauma inflicted on their children. Thomas personally delivered information to each family, ensuring they had everything needed to pursue justice through both criminal and civil courts. The message was clear. Stuart and Gail Decker wouldn't just spend their lives in prison. They would spend those lives knowing that dozens of families were dedicated to ensuring they never escaped accountability for their crimes. By the end of the month, the network's destruction was complete. Customers were in prison or facing prosecution. Financial assets were frozen. Infrastructure was dismantled, and victims were receiving comprehensive support. But Thomas had one final act of justice to perform. Chapter 8: The Reckoning. 6 months after the arrests, Stuart and Gail Decker stood trial in federal court. The evidence Thomas had gathered was overwhelming. Thousands of hours of surveillance footage, financial records, victim testimonies, and recorded conversations that left no doubt about their guilt. Thomas attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Stuart and Gail could see him. He wanted them to understand that their actions had consequences and that those consequences would follow them for the rest of their lives. The prosecution, led by federal attorney Clinton Bridges, methodically presented Thomas's evidence. Each day brought new revelations about the network's scope and the defendants' roles in traumatizing dozens of children. The evidence shows, Bridges told the jury, that Stuart and Gail Decker operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that treated children as commodities to be bought and sold. They showed no mercy to their victims, and they deserve none from this court. Defense attorneys tried to argue that the defendants were themselves victims of larger criminal organizations, but Thomas's evidence proved that Stuart and Gail had been active architects of the network rather than unwilling participants. The most powerful testimony came from the children themselves. Dr. Abbott had worked with each victim to help them understand what had happened and prepare them to speak in court if they chose to do so. 12 of the children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, testified about their experiences. Their words were devastating. "They told me my parents didn't want me anymore," said 9-year-old Maria Santos. But it wasn't true. The bad people were lying. "I knew something was wrong," testified 11-year-old Marcus Johnson. "But every time I tried to tell someone, the lady would give me medicine that made me sleepy." Thomas watched Stuart and Gail's faces during the victim testimonies. Any remaining pretense of innocence crumbled as they confronted the human cost of their crimes. The defense's closing argument was brief and ineffective. There was simply no way to explain away Thomas's methodical documentation of their criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, Judge Lewis Simons addressed the defendants with barely controlled anger. "In 30 years on the bench," Judge Simons said, "I have never encountered crimes more calculated, more cruel, or more destructive than those you have committed. You have traumatized dozens of children and devastated their families for profit." Stuart Decker received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on the trafficking charges, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling 180 years for the individual counts of child endangerment. Gail Decker received the same sentence. "You will spend the rest of your lives in prison," Judge Simons concluded, and that is exactly what justice demands. As the defendants were led away, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. His intelligence training and military discipline had enabled him to systematically dismantle a criminal organization and ensure that its leadership faced appropriate consequences. But Thomas's mission extended beyond the courtroom. In the months following the trial, Thomas used his security consulting expertise to help law enforcement agencies across the country identify and investigate similar networks. His methodical approach to evidence gathering became a model for trafficking investigations nationwide. Thomas also worked with Dr. Abbott to establish the Survivor Recovery Foundation, funded by the assets seized from the network. The foundation provided comprehensive support services for trafficking victims and their families, ensuring that the children had access to therapy, education, and long-term care. Jimmy recovered fully from his ordeal, though the family maintained regular counseling sessions to address any lingering effects of the trauma. The experience had brought the family closer together and reinforced their appreciation for the safety and security they'd once taken for granted. Most importantly, Jimmy never learned the full extent of what had been done to him. Thomas and Nicole agreed that their son deserved to grow up without carrying the burden of understanding how close he'd come to serious harm. Ellen Irwin received a commendation from the Cleveland Police Department for her vigilance in reporting the suspicious activity that had started Thomas's investigation. She became an advocate for neighborhood watch programs and child safety initiatives. Ray Morrison pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received a 15-year prison sentence. His business empire collapsed, and his family was forced to relocate due to the public shame associated with his crimes. The other customers identified by Thomas faced similar fates: prison sentences, financial ruin, and social ostracism that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Thomas had achieved something rare in his intelligence career: complete mission success. Every objective had been accomplished, every enemy neutralized, and every victim recovered. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas had proven that evil actions have consequences and that those who prey on the innocent will eventually face justice. The network was gone, the victims were safe, and the perpetrators would spend their lives paying for their crimes. Thomas Savage had kept his promise to protect his family and deliver justice to those who had threatened them. Chapter 9: New Beginnings. 2 years after the arrests, Thomas stood in the backyard watching Jimmy play soccer with friends from the neighborhood. His son had grown taller, his laugh was as infectious as ever, and there were no remaining signs of the trauma he'd endured as a victim of the trafficking network. The Savage family had found their new normal. Nicole returned to teaching with a renewed passion for protecting vulnerable children. She'd implemented new safety protocols at her school and regularly spoke to parent groups about recognizing signs of abuse. Thomas continued his security consulting work, but with a different focus. He specialized in helping organizations identify and prevent exploitation of their employees and customers. His reputation for thoroughness and discretion made him highly sought after by companies wanting to ensure they weren't unknowingly facilitating criminal activity. The Survivor Recovery Foundation had grown into a national organization, providing support to hundreds of trafficking victims and their families. Dr. Rebecca Abbott served as executive director, while Thomas chaired the board and provided strategic oversight. Stuart and Gail Decker remained in federal prison, serving their life sentences in facilities located in different states. Thomas received periodic updates on their status through his law enforcement contacts. Both had been placed in protective custody due to repeated threats from other inmates who learned about their crimes against children. Neither had shown any remorse for their actions or attempted to make amends to their victims. Thomas was satisfied with that outcome. Some people couldn't be rehabilitated, and Stuart and Gail had proven through their actions that they viewed children as commodities rather than human beings. They deserved to spend their lives isolated from society, unable to harm anyone else. The other network members had received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years, depending on their roles in the organization. Several customers were still awaiting trial as prosecutors worked through the massive amount of evidence Thomas had provided. Ray Morrison died of a heart attack in prison after serving 18 months of a sentence. Thomas felt no satisfaction at the news. Morrison's death didn't undo the harm he'd caused, and it deprived his victims of seeing him face full accountability for his crimes. Ellen Irwin remained the Savage family's beloved neighbor, but now she was also a close friend who understood the importance of community vigilance in protecting children. She'd started a neighborhood watch program that had been adopted by communities across Ohio. On a warm Saturday evening, Thomas found himself in the same backyard where he'd played with Jimmy 2 years earlier, before learning about the network that had been exploiting his son. Jimmy was older now, more confident, and completely unaware of the sophisticated operation that had once threatened his safety. "Dad, want to help me set up the tent?" Jimmy called from across the yard. He was planning a camping trip with his friends, an adventure that would have terrified Thomas 2 years ago, but now felt like a normal part of childhood. "Absolutely, buddy." As they worked together to assemble the camping equipment, Thomas reflected on everything that had changed since Ellen Irwin first approached him with concerns about crying in the night. He'd used his intelligence training to protect his family and deliver justice to those who'd threatened them. But more importantly, he'd learned that the most effective weapon against evil was the willingness to act on behalf of those who couldn't protect themselves. The 28 children recovered from the network were all receiving support and rebuilding their lives. Several had maintained contact with Thomas through the foundation, sending him updates on their progress and thanking him for his role in their rescue. Those relationships reminded Thomas why his mission had been necessary and worthwhile. "Dad," Jimmy's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look serious. Everything okay?" Thomas smiled and ruffled his son's hair. "Everything's perfect, Jimmy. I was just thinking about how lucky we are." "Lucky how?" "Lucky to have each other. Lucky to live in a safe neighborhood with good people who look out for each other. Lucky to have friends like Ellen who care enough to speak up when something's wrong." Jimmy nodded seriously. "Mom says you helped a lot of kids who were in trouble." Thomas had wondered when this conversation would happen. Jimmy was getting old enough to understand that his father worked on cases involving children, though he didn't know about his own connection to those cases. "Sometimes people do bad things to kids," Thomas said carefully. "When that happens, it's important for adults to work together to make sure the kids are safe. Like how you and Ellen and Dr. Abbott work together?" "Exactly like that." Jimmy seemed satisfied with the explanation and returned to organizing his camping supplies. Thomas watched his son's easy confidence and normal childhood enthusiasm, knowing that Jimmy would never fully understand how close he'd come to a very different life. That was exactly as it should be. As the sun set over their suburban neighborhood, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. His family was safe. The criminals who'd threatened them were in prison, and the victims they'd recovered were rebuilding their lives with comprehensive support. The network was gone, its infrastructure dismantled, and its financial resources redirected to help survivors. Justice had been served completely and systematically. Thomas Savage had proven that with the right skills, resources, and determination, it was possible to protect the innocent and ensure that predators faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. The mission was complete, but the vigilance would never end. Thomas knew that other networks existed, other children needed protection, and other families required defenders who were willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe. He'd spent 10 years in military intelligence learning how to identify and neutralize threats to national security. Now he'd spent 2 years proving that those same skills could be used to protect what mattered most: family, community, and the innocence of children who deserved to grow up safe from those who would exploit them. As Jimmy called his friends to coordinate their camping adventure, Thomas smiled and headed inside to help Nicole prepare dinner. The war was won, but the vigilance would continue. Some victories were worth everything it took to achieve them. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.